back to Weekly Briefing. We are here with our panel of experts. Joining me in studio, Chris Farrell, Director of Investigations at Judicial Watch and author of Exiled Emissary George Earl III. Andrew Naggs, CEO of Paysum Solutions International. Dr. Shay Bradley Farrell, President of Counterpoint Institute for Policy, Research, and Education. And Matt Braynard, Executive Director for Look Ahead America. Joe Biden spoke at a virtual fundraising event. Rather than posting a video of his speech, they shared the audio only. Why? Also, the remarks he made are a bit deceptive.
I think we've put together one of the most consequential campaigns in modern history because it really was, in my view, a battle for the soul of the nation. The single most important thing that we have to do is we have to protect the voting system, protect the sacred right to vote. And look, if we make the right decisions in the next few years, in 50 years, people are going to look back and say, this was the moment that America won the 21st century. I really believe that.
This is really weird. Matt, what's your response?
Well, they couldn't do video because you can hear a jump cut. What they're doing with the video, and you actually could hear it a little bit, is they're piecing together little bits of coherence that they could get out of him and stringing it together to have a coherent speech. And to be clear, there is no friendlier audience for Joe Biden than the DNC summer meeting. Historically, the president would show up in person. It's a love fest. These people love him. This is the leadership of the Democrat National Party. And it's an easy place for him to go and give a completely off-the-cuff speech and completely casual, but he could not manage that. They had to send audio, which is clearly spliced together. And I just think it speaks to a guy who's just not all there.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think about them? Well, we don't have to show the video. Just take these sound bites.
Right. There's a very sophisticated, technically sophisticated organization called the White House Communications Agency, WACA, mostly military folks. They can communicate for the president to virtually anyone, anywhere, in any medium you can imagine. So if they really wanted to get a message out, as Matthew just said, to a red meat audience of his, I assure you WACA could get a video and sound and they could stream it, and it would be great. But as he pointed to, they can't. And also, they had to give him these crazy lines to talk about how, a phonied up election somehow is the future of America and it changed.
And we have to protect it. And what?
It is just.
We have to protect it, but we can't do any audits. We can't let anybody see any transparency, and everybody just has to take our word for it. And that's how we're going to protect you.
There's more 1984 illusions in this, but I
love your 1984 illusions.
Yeah. What bothered me was when he said we're fighting for the soul of our country, because we've seen them fight for the soul. They're trying to control our souls, control our thoughts, and our freedom, our freedom of speech.
Yeah, no, I actually think what he said is accurate. Yeah. It's just flipped.
And very, very cool.
And this actually, the thing that it reminds me of is the reported comments that LBJ had on the eve as he was trying to encourage Democratic legislators to support civil rights legislation about how if we pass these laws, we will continue winning elections for many decades into the future. I'm paraphrasing there. You can look it up. You can Google it. But that's exactly what this sounds like.
That's what that was all about. And to that point, it's even cryptic that there's no video for it. We want to be transparent. We have to protect elections, but we're going to splice it, and we're going to cover up the video. So violent crime is on the rise. 2 violent criminals fired shots into a crowd in Queens, New York, striking 10 people. The 2 gunmen were then picked up on scooters and made their getaway. All 10 victims were taken to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. Why is such violent crime on the rise? Shay.
I think it's fundamentally because our government, the Biden administration, is anti-police and they are anti-law enforcement. Very recently, I just had a friend of mine who is a high-ranking official in law enforcement in New York tell me that police were afraid to get out of the cars during, crimes happening. They would much prefer to wait and file a report rather than actually be proactive and stop the crime because they're afraid of not having the support of the government behind them. And think about the border. What's going on the border? It's chaos. The law is not being enforced. Law enforcement officers, federal and local, are having their hands tied, for actually doing their job.
Yeah. Andrew, what do you think about the basically disregard for rule of law?
Well, look, Americans are aware of the fact that crime is on the rise. Just here in the district in D.C., homicides are up something on the order of 3 to 5%. Car theft is up 25%, thereabouts. And the issue is that we, the right, Republicans, conservatives, are not controlling or attacking this narrative.
Yeah.
We clearly are the party of law and order. We have to act like it. And feckless Republicans on the Hill and in state legislatures cannot continue turning a blind eye to this, whether it's Governor Abbott down in Texas with respect to the southern border, or any number of other state legislators and executives. We have to seize this moment and speak directly to the American people and start providing some solutions. And it's very clear, as you stated, it's about enforcing our laws.
Yeah, and Matt, I just want to ask you, what is your position on elected leaders and feckless Republicans failing to require elected officials to follow the rule of law?
It's a chronic problem, and it's you look at New York. What's the solution? We've fallen so far away from the city that Rudy Giuliani recreated. And how did Rudy Giuliani bring New York back? Mm-hmm. Law and order. Yeah. Right. And now we have a mayor and, in fact, a governor and a state legislature up there that, oh, there's a crime, let's send some social workers.
Right.
Let's send some social workers. So when there's no real consequence for antisocial behavior, and look, I lived in Harlem for 2 years. I just moved back to Virginia recently. The respect for law and order there is effectively zero. Why? Because there's no consequence. And, ultimately, it's on the people of New York. Because that's who they elected. And every day, more and more decent, hardworking people are leaving that city. More and more of that tiny little sliver that pays all the taxes are finding excuses not to come back into work to Wall Street anymore. And,
Donald Trump left.
The problem with democracy is ultimately people get what they deserve.
Right. Well, on that note, California's recall election of Gavin Newsom is scheduled for September 14th. Due to the Delta variant, they are mailing ballots to all voters, whether you asked for a mail-in ballot or not. Sound familiar? Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, this notion of doing it because of the Delta variant is preposterous.
Yeah.
They would have said due to prevailing southwesterly breezes they're sending out. And it's not just to all registered voters. They're sending out ballots basically to every single street address they can find. And that's been the problem with, highly suspect elections in California. There's the issue of ballot harvesting and, folks gathering up ballots that are left basically in the hallway of apartment buildings. This is ripe for voter fraud. California is a disaster, and as long as they keep conducting elections this way, they are so prone to all sorts of abuse and misconduct, it staggers the imagination.
Right. Well, Matt, don't you think it's a bit brazen that they're coming out and doing this now while there's still states demanding audits and while they're still investigating the last election that used mail-in ballots? And people are just supposed to accept this as, this is totally legitimate.
I don't think this is actually going to go the way they expect it to be. I don't think this is going to be helpful to them because all of the mechanisms that supposedly funny games happen in California, all of those happen anyway. Those are already in place. And what you're potentially going to have happening here is California going into a new lockdown, average person on the street, regardless of their political background, having their lives turned upside down. And you're basically giving them a piece of paper that lets them flip the whole table over. And I'm not sure that's going to come out and play the way they expect it, is by reducing the burden of casting a ballot when you've got an electorate that is basically put in prison. There are bigger problems with the electorate right now, or with that race, primarily the fact that none of the opponents have any of the financial resources to make the case for why they should run. In our small Twitterverse of, on the right, we all say, Larry Elders, he's great. Maybe there's a couple other people we like. But to the average California voter, reaching them is extremely expensive. And none of these candidates have brought forth the financial resources that would be necessary for that to penetrate. And again, there's a strong impulse to flip the table over, but part of that impulse and what made it so successful last time around with Gray Davis is, hey, you had a really exciting, cool guy that everyone knew. He didn't even have to spend any money because he'd be on television nonstop. It was sort of like Donald Trump. He didn't have to spend money to be on TV. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Right. Really compelling reason to just bump up a couple extra points to sway that recall vote. But we don't really have that. And I think that's probably a bigger problem than the current, the solution of sending out everybody a ballot because of Delta.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Don't go anywhere. When we come back from the break, we'll discuss the eviction moratorium. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Weekly Briefing. Democrats in Congress supposedly forgot to extend the eviction moratorium that went into place during the pandemic. The Biden administration wanted to make it clear they tried everything they could do but could not find a legal way to extend the moratorium. And then they extended the moratorium.
Moratorium. She seems to believe that the administration can do it. So what is the disconnect here? Why does she believe you have the power to extend the moratorium, but the administration is arguing you don't?
Well, I would say that on this particular issue, the president's not only kicked the tires, he has double, triple, quadruple checked. He has asked the CDC to look at whether you could even do targeted eviction moratorium that just went to the counties.
And here is White House Press Secretary all but acknowledging they're disregarding the law.
We don't control the courts. We don't know what they will do. We are all aware of the Supreme Court decision at the end of June and what was outlined in their decision at the end of June. This is also going to be a temporary solution regardless, and longer-term solution will require legislative action.
Chris, it's illegal. There's no way we can do it. Oh, well, we're just going to do it.
You caught them lying again, and what you just saw is a cheap publicity stunt that allows them to say, we're all for eviction moratorium, and then we'll let the courts figure it out. It's dishonest, it's cheap. The American public gets screwed again.
And the Supreme Court just came out in June. That's what Psaki was referring to. They came out in June saying it is illegal to extend the moratorium without legislation.
Yeah, they don't care.
Yeah.
Okay? They don't care what's legal or illegal. They're going to go for a political stunt for maximum PR purposes.
Right.
Everything else be damned.
Andrew, what's your response?
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. It is a public relations stunt, but it's also clumsy. It's very clumsy, and it sort of highlights this inside baseball feature of the Biden administration where their communication strategy is so disjointed. That said, there really is nothing that is intended to come of this except for the appearance of action.
Yeah.
And communicating, as you said, to the supporters that care about these things, that they're flouting any sort of adherence to the rule of law and that they just don't care.
Yeah, that's right. Joe Biden spoke this week on his favorite topic, the vaccine, or more specifically, the unvaccinated. He said COVID is moving like wildfire through the unvaccinated community.
It's moving like wildfire through the unvaccinated community. And it's heartbreaking, particularly because it's preventable. That's why we're doing everything we can to get more people vaccinated. And we're seeing real results.
Dr. Shay, your response.
This is so frustrating. He doesn't connect this with the fact that he is personally responsible for thousands of illegal immigrants being COVID positive coming into our country.
Yeah, tested positive and are admitted in.
Yes.
Yeah.
7,000 in McAllen, Texas alone. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry that he's heartbroken about this, but he is, again, missing the connection here, and his credibility will go up if he does something about the border.
Matt, what's your response?
And it's not just these illegal immigrants coming in tested positive for COVID. It's like if you had a plan to spread Delta variant as fast as possible, you'd take a bunch of infected people and spread them all throughout the country to all the next. And what are they doing? They're bringing in these illegal immigrants because they hope eventually they'll anchor baby and vote for them or whatever. And they're positive for COVID, and they're sending them like with plane tickets and train tickets and buses all over the country to spread the disease. And he doesn't really get the right to wave a finger about vaccination. His administration officials, including his own vice president and many DNC paid spokespeople, went out when President Trump was saying, hey, we're going to get this vaccine right away, warp speed. They're saying, oh, I'm not taking that Trump vaccine. I don't trust it. Until they make an act of contrition for those remarks, he does not get to wave the finger at anybody for having hesitancy about taking this vaccine. He and his administration and the people behind it are at the root of it. They were the first ones to raise that what do we call it, vaccine denial or vaccine hesitancy. They were at the root of it. They pioneered it. So he does not get to make those accusations.
All right, it is time for the lightning round. Here we have 3 minutes and give the panelists each 10 seconds to answer and get through as many questions as possible. We'll start with Chris Farrell. How is the Biden administration testing for the Delta variant, or are the numbers real?
There are no numbers, and wait till we get to the, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th mutation of the virus.
They're not, and they've admitted as much recently, and they are relying on the experts.
Right.
Yep, they said it. There isn't any.
There's no way to figure it out.
Yeah.
We're at a rare moment where there's actually nobody that the public in general trusts for anything on the medical front on this, because we've been lied to over and over again. We're not actually going to get any real answers about what's happening, and it's be about 10 years from now before they figured out, oh, this is what really happened.
I think that's probably true. What is more dangerous, COVID or violent crime?
Violent crime by far.
Absolutely, violent crime.
Totally agreed. Violent crime, hands down.
Oh, violent crime, especially if you live in a Democrat-run city.
That is very true. Do these new mask mandates cause people to question the mandate's legitimacy?
The public is exhausted with the mask runaround. No one believes it.
The masks are just a marker for larger problems with the way that this pandemic is being handled. So, yes.
Nobody knows what's going on with mask mandates. It's so confusing. Who knows?
The mandates, but then open the border,
Yeah, whatever.
I think that eventually what the science is going to show is that masks were actually making it worse. And all the CDC studies we've seen so far say either they don't work or they hedge their bets. That's the CDC's own research. And I believe that ultimately, because when you're in close proximity, where you're supposed to be at most risk to spread the disease and you're wearing the mask, you're raising your voice, which means you're projecting more of this into the atmosphere, and it's more likely to transmit. So, mark that. Mark today's state.
Okay, very good. Are Americans trusting the Biden administration more or less as time goes on?
Less.
Less.
Me? Much less.
Did they trust them to begin with?
That is actually a fair question. Do Americans see the hypocrisy of the way January 6th is being handled?
Absolutely. It is schizophrenic in its approach.
Not enough Americans. We need to shed more light on this issue. And thanks to Matt, I hope we will.
Yeah, I agree. Not enough. That's why I'm glad Matt said what he said. He hit the nail on the head.
We can measure our progress on this issue by the fact that now President Trump is speaking about it. Now members of Congress are showing up and making their voices heard, and people are sending letters. We're marking this. We're showing the more we raise the issue, the more the politicians pay attention. That's how it works.
All right, don't go anywhere. When we come back from the break, we cover this week's panel's choice and see which topics they thought were important. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the panel's choice. Here we ask each panel member to pick a topic from this week that they feel is important to discuss. We'll start with Andrew's pick. Army patrols hit the streets of Sydney on Monday to help enforce coronavirus curbs as Australia struggles to stop the Delta variant from spreading. Around 300 unarmed military personnel have been tasked with going door to door, checking that people who have tested positive are isolating at home, and they are also accompanying police officers on the hunt for rule breakers. Let's see that.
Army patrols hit the streets of Sydney on Monday to help enforce coronavirus curbs as Australia struggles to stop the Delta variant from spreading. Around 300 unarmed military personnel have been tasked with going door to door, checking that people who have tested positive are isolating at home. They're also accompanying police officers on the hunt for rule breakers.
Andrew, this seems dangerous.
Yeah, I'd agree. And we need to pay attention to this because we are a hair's breadth away from politicians and public leaders enforcing these mandates using the military and armed force. And the mechanism by which they would do it is through emergency management at the state level and at the federal level. And there's a desire for it. So if we need to pay attention, because if we are not ready to push back on this, we could see patrols in our streets enforcing these mandates. Now look at the way that they reacted in January and all of the overreaction, I would say, and the continued overreaction to those who are not willing to bend to the administration's will. I think that you could very easily see these armed patrols, even though in Australia they're unarmed. You could very easily see this becoming another tool that's being applied in the overall sort of administration's toolkit against the American people.
And does this not seem like federal overreach? I mean, states could take that step if they wanted to, and none of them really have. You know, the thought of the federal government coming in and doing it seems a little excessive.
Well, you say that's true, but let's not fixate on the units or the armed force. It's the fact that you would have the government, either whether it's the state government or the federal government, actually going around
coming to your house
and pushing people into their homes. It's sort of a reverse Katrina, right? And, you know, down the line, you might see even disarming and taking away weapons and that sort of thing.
Very interesting topic. Thank you. Next, we've got Chris's pick, betraying the Cuban people again. Chris says in his latest article that Biden doesn't give a darn about Cubans throwing off over 60 years of communism. Tell us about it, Chris.
Yeah, so empty, hollow platitudes from the Biden administration concerning how they stand with the Cuban people. What does that look like? What does that mean, standing with the Cuban people? For 62 years, Cuba has been under a brutal communist dictatorship, whether it was the Castro brothers, Fidel or his younger brother, or the current president, Diaz, who, look, let's be very clear, the current president of Cuba could machine gun the protesters out in the streets, and Biden administration would do nothing, zero. The real problem is, and it's a 60-year-long problem, 7th Special Forces Group should have been parachuted, detachments should have been parachuted into Cuba decades ago. There should have been a partisan army raised, trained, and the communist dictatorship overthrown. Biden's failed to do it. Frankly, Trump failed to do it in Venezuela, which is a shame. And the Biden administration, their big reaction to Cuban protests and uprising in the streets is they're going to sanction two police officials and 1 public administrator. That's their reaction.
Well, and it's interesting how the Biden administration is having the Coast Guard, which actually kind of makes sense, enforce the law in Florida as far as Cubans coming into Florida, but not on our southern border, you know, where you have 100 and how many of our other countries coming through our southern border. They just make them take the long way. Yeah,
it's more schizophrenia when it comes to application of the rule of law. That's another, it's a related but separate problem. You know, the real issue is phony politicians, frankly, of both parties, will go down to Miami and they'll have lunch at the Cafe Versailles and they'll posture and wave their finger, and they will do nothing for people who have suffered 60 years of work camps, indoctrination, all the communist techniques and tactics that have been used against these people. And American politicians show up, they say a few things, they pat Cubans on the head, and they shove them out of the way. Nothing's changed. And that's the real tragedy. And Biden is being hailed as a wonderful advocate for the Cuban people. No, he's not.
Right.
The administration's a absolute leadership failure.
Well, thank you very much for the topic. Next, we've got Dr. Shays Pick. Don't believe a man can be a woman? Prepare to be labeled an extremist. Dr. Shay, tell us about your article.
Well, a couple of weeks ago on the show, I talked about how the transgender movement, supported by our administration and Democrats in Congress, are creating these new rights in policy and legislation that actually give credence or support to the claim that gender identity or your gender is fluid and it's a matter of opinion. But it's gone beyond that, and that's something that we need to be careful with and be aware of, like Andrew was talking about in his topic. there is within this movement, there's a real force to censor our beliefs.
It's an absolute truth thing. There's no absolute truth. There's no man, there's no woman, there's no black, there's no white.
That's right. And you know what it boils down to is freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, and hey, actual science that a man cannot be a woman. There are a lot of examples of this censorship. New York and California, other states have imposed fines on people for misusing someone's so-called preferred pronoun. A few months ago in Newsweek, we saw an article in there calling out military leadership who were labeling people who did not support gender identity claims as extremists. The Equality Act, you and I have talked about before, awaiting confirmation in the Senate, it will change civil rights law to support these gender identity claims, but there's written into the findings of it now, Christina, the findings say that if your perception can form the basis of discrimination, you remember that? Yeah. So I look at you, I assume that you're a woman. That, according to the findings, is a stereotype, a sex-based stereotype, and can be discrimination.
It's about civil litigation. That's what it's really about.
That's insane. That's insane.
Is insane.
What is your perception, because I know you've followed the issue closely, particularly with the Equality Act, of the American public's perception? Because I'm starting to see that people are pushing back, going, okay, well, like, we want to help you, we want to give you, whatever you need to live your life happy and full, but let's not be crazy.
Right, and you know what? You hit on the good news. I always like to leave us with some good news. The good news that we need to remember is that the vast majority of Americans do not believe in this. They believe in science. They believe in religion, freedom of belief. They do not believe a man can be a woman can be a man. And we can't, a friend of mine who's actually a self-proclaimed radical feminist doesn't believe in these things and says that the majority she calls us the silenced majority because we have been so pushed down, we're afraid to speak truth. We can't do that. We cannot allow ourselves to be the silenced majority. It doesn't matter how many times that people say that truth is subjective or relative or that fact is really fiction. We have on our side religion, conscience, science, reason. So can't let ourselves be silenced.
Yeah. Very interesting topic. Thank you so much. Lastly, we've got Matt's pick. Look Ahead America has actively resisted the skewed narrative surrounding January 6th and is hosting a rally at the nation's capital on September 18th at noon. Matt, what is so important about resisting this narrative?
You've heard the phrase political prisoner for a long time, and usually what that conjures in your mind are places like China or Russia or Cuba. But now that applies to us. Just 1 mile from where we're recording this is a prison where they're holding between 50 and 100 political prisoners who are having their due process denied, who are not violent, who expressed their First Amendment rights on January 6th. And they're being targeted exclusively because of their political beliefs. And to further this phony narrative of there being an insurrection on January 6th, from the beginning of the year, Look Ahead America has been leading on this issue. In January, we sent a letter to the Department of Justice and FBI demanding that charges be dropped against all nonviolent offenders, as had been the precedent for every other protest that's happened at the Capitol and has continued to happen at the Capitol. A month ago, we led a protest at the Department of Justice to demand, again, that they drop these charges. About a month ago, or a couple weeks ago, we led a protest at the prison where these people were being held, and we held 10 satellite rallies all across the country. And as we continue to raise the volume and shine the spotlight on this injustice, we're starting to make progress. So we're seeing, a few weeks ago, members of Congress show up at the Department of Justice to protest. We see, exactly 1 week ago, members of Congress showing up at that prison, demanding to see the conditions these people are being held in. And the thing is, we're not going to stop until we get what we want.
And this is really extraordinary. If you could just break this down, I know you've been working on this issue really, really intensely. How many people are being held, and explain what they're being held for? It's outrageous.
Right. So around the country in different prisons, we're estimating over 100 people are being held for crimes which the Department of Justice is trying to get them to plead guilty to parading, which is apparently it's a real serious crime when you do it near the Capitol building. So the problem here is that if they treated these people like they treat every other protester who gets arrested at the Capitol or somewhere nearby for doing a sit-in or something traditional in the civil rights repertoire of techniques, they get like a $35 fine. They're let go that day, right? These people, they're in many cases charging them with felonies. Months and months or years in prison is what they're looking at, despite the fact that they did nothing violent, they didn't destroy anything, they didn't hurt anybody. The reason is that if they let these people off with just a slap on the wrist like they've ever let everybody else off, well, then the whole insurrection narrative disappears. And without the insurrection narrative, you can't go after people's guns. You can't deploy Capitol Police all over the country. You can't purge the military of patriots. All of the actions that the administration is trying to take now is based on the phony premise that there was a dangerous white supremacist insurrection on January 6th. So we're pushing back against that, and we're going right back to where it started, right back to the Capitol on Saturday, September 18th. We're going to have a huge rally there. Or we're going to demonstrate and shine the spotlight on the real evidence on what happened that day and demand justice for these people being held in prison, demand justice for Ashley Babbitt, and demand a full investigation to what the FBI's involvement was, demand the release of all of the footage that's being suppressed by the federal government of what happened that day.
All right. Saturday, September 18th, just down the street here, right at the Capitol.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. When we come back from the break, we've got this week's Don't Be Fooled and the closing argument. Don't go anywhere.